died. His wife died 9 later. It's a remarkable story. He traveled. I can't imagine this the courage of traveling sort of the back roads of Florida, where the Klan was so active, investigating lynchings, encouraging people to join the NAACP. But anyway,
but you were in Florida
doing
at the time,
research for
right?
that film, I was at the University of Florida, and we came across a book by a historian who's now at Duke. Then he was at the University of Wisconsin, Tim Tyson, on Rob Williams. And we were fascinated with it, but we're in the midst of this film, so we sort of put it to the back burner. And when we finished the story on Harry, we went back and to sort of pick up Rob, and discovered that there had been some interest, but the film had not been pursued for financial reasons. And we had enough seed money and began writing grants to do the film. So that was the beginning. So yes, Harry T. Moore was the inspiration. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's well, we're considering Rob Williams, and it's a very unique time when there's a lot of discussion about a lot of activity in the Black liberation movement, and Rob Williams was an internationalist, and what's going on now is in response to George Floyd's murder is international.
Yes.
So I just want to recognize that, and I picked up the Sunday New York Times today, and had to notice that, probably because people were in the streets, and also because some of the Black employees and reporters were in revolt about some things that happened at the New York Times recently, that in this edition, this full of articles on opinion pieces about Black people and racial justice. And the headline about columnist Janelle Boyd says, "We needed to overturn white supremacy." Professor Keandra Yamada Taylor says, our best leaders are not elected officials, they are organizers and workers. And finally, the Chicago-based activist Mariam Kaba suggests, yes, we mean literally abolish the police. So it's sort of hard to think of that happening, certainly not happening in Rob Williams' time. And even a few weeks ago here, I mean, the last thing that there was I noticed too, was there were even recipes about how to celebrate Juneteenth. So it's like, this is, just all over the New York Times. And we don't have to talk about this now, but later I want to look at how the Times had covered Rob Williams. And I found a couple of places, and we can talk about that too. You may have actually, in your research, found some things too.
Sure.
Yeah. So there are a lot of interesting details about Rob Williams' background, his life and work, and as you mentioned, head of the NAACP, his support that he generated in the outside of his region. He's a publisher of a newspaper, The Crusader, that went out beyond North Carolina, and an advocate for armed self-defense. And I'm just putting up a bunch of sort of facts about him that I want to put out there that people may have know about him. But he was also from Monroe, North Carolina, which is also the home place of Jesse Helms. So
yes,
yes, and so what were the things that when you discussed doing the film, that you decided you wanted to focus on? Because the film is focused on certain aspects of his life.
Sure. I guess every filmmaker, every artist is different, but there are some things we probably have in common. And for me, I'm always looking for a touchstone, sort of what is this film about at a deeper level? And this was a journey. in getting to this place of really investing in Rob's righteous anger. And so that became the touchstone of the film. You're going to see it and maybe if you haven't seen the film or you go back and you see, I mean, even sort of the colors in the film, it is that anger, but it is appreciating and focusing on that the righteousness of what we considered, or the righteousness of his anger. And so that was a touchstone. So that led us to starting the film pretty early with maybe less about, the facts of, these were his grandparents, although they're fascinating. His grandmother, gave him a rifle, but rather what were his psychological motivations. And so, early on, you open up with the setting of the town and the music of Lead Belly about this bourgeoisie town and the attitudes there. And then Rob telling the story of his dad working on the railway and his dad doing all the work and the white man coming in drunk. And people saying to Rob, you should be like your dad. He's no trouble. And then, it's that notion of sort of what was motivating Rob, and seeing the woman being dragged, down the street, accosted, a Black woman. And, he tells a story in depth that is in a longer sort of theatrical version of the film, and about watching, it's another incident of watching a sheriff dragging a Black woman up the sidewalk with her dress coming up over her head. And how angry he was, but how angry he also was as a young boy of the Black men that were standing by that turned their head down and looked at the sidewalk because of the period of time and how standing up could cost them their job, cost them their lives in that community. And so he was so motivated by that anger that became a touchstone of the film, and it became sort of the focal points. The other thing I might mention, and please jump in at any time, Cornelius, because I could talk forever.
Well, you mentioned about theatrical version of the film, and I didn't know there was a theatrical version.
Well, it's a screening. Well, we did some screenings that were longer, that we have a longer version of the film. At film festival, some of them played longer. So sort of back to kind of what focal points of the film, a couple of things. It was really important, particularly as a white filmmaker, that the voice of the film, the story of the film, be the Williams family's film. So two things transpired. Before we even signed on the dotted line on this film, I flew to Detroit to sit down with the family, with Mabel Williams, and ask how they felt about a white directors being involved in the film, and that would they work with us very closely so that the story was their story and not our story. And she was most gracious and, believed that it would be great to have that kind of a partnership or coalition. But we have 22, maybe 23 hours, and this was really a turning point for the film, of pristine audio recording of Rob. And that was done by freelance television journalists, and much of that has never been heard until this film. So Rob dictated what you see as the focal points. So Rob basically relates the story from about 1957 through 69. Well, yes, parts of 69. It's so in the film, you'll notice we don't have a narrator. So Rob is narrating his story most of the way through. Mabel picks up the slack and tells the story, and then we have other people coming in and doing specific details. And I think, so what you see in terms of the focal points are what Rob, in that audio recording and in their archives at the Bentley Archives at the University of Michigan, were what we had more materials of, and it's, everybody knows it's listening in a film club, is that we also face the constraints of what we can find visually. And
so the question about the audio recordings, now, were these done before he went into exile or after?
No. I think, I'm trying to remember the exact date, Cornelius. I think it was actually done when he came back.
Okay.
69, latter part of 69.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. And another question I had about, because the film has Mabel, his wife, but it also has people in the community who are also part of the gun club, and also folks who were, who were around the Monroe, North Carolina. And so tell us about that, how you found people. Did Mabel introduce you to them, or?
Yes. Mabel introduced us to sort of a person that was really key in sort of moving in the community. She's no longer with us. It was a woman named Pat Coffey, a cousin of Rob. And so everywhere we went, we didn't go anywhere without Pat sort of taking us through the community and introducing us to folks that knew Rob.
And question about, are there things in this film, in the version that people have seen, that things that you left out that you would want to, that you say, oh, I really, so sorry we had to cut this out for length purposes, that you would want to have people see?
There are certainly things that we would like to see in the film that did not get into the film. In some instances, it might be because of time constraints, other instances because of visual constraints, other instances because not having enough context to know about the veracity of the memory of folks when they're remembering things. I mean, you touched on something very early. We were so frustrated by our futile search for the documents of Jesse Helms. And, in particular, Helms' interview of Rob on the day of the alleged kidnapping, but then he did a series of Jesse Helms did a series of radio broadcasts.
We be assuming that everybody knows.
Yeah, you may not know who Jesse Helms. Yeah.
Tell us who he was.
Well, Jesse Helms was a senator, and for those of you of a certain generation, I mean, Jesse Helms was. I'm searching for diplomatic kind.
You don't need to be diplomatic.
Yeah, right. Very racist. Wow, you can help me out. Anybody, Cornelius. He certainly racist, he was a huge white ring, advocate of sort of all the negatives we think of a Southern, sort of way.
So he was a journalist. He had a newspaper or a column or a radio show, or what was he before he became a politician?
Jesse Helms was a journalist, broadcaster, and in fact, on the day of that, a white couple was allegedly kidnapped. Jesse Helms was the only journalist to do an interview with Rob Williams about it.
But that's interesting that he would. Well, I mean, that maybe there were no national journalists who cared about it enough, and Jesse Helms was there. but it brings up to me, like, why would the reaction of Rob Williams, because he probably knew who Jesse Helms was, that he would give him an interview. That's kind of amazing. And just
Yeah,
not tell him that keep walking. I don't want to talk to you.
Understandably, Robert's an interesting guy. I see him just being absolutely open to the notion of fine. I'm going to speak my mind, and however you feel about it doesn't matter to me. And
Well, one of the things I was curious about now, so the people who have not seen the film and maybe don't know the story, is that Rob got accused of falsely kidnapping a white couple who came to an area, and they got scared, and they were and Rob was kind of protecting them. They never said that they were kidnapped, but the state said that, leveled a charge against him. So they fled. Rob and Mabel and his kids, they fled out of North Carolina, and eventually get to Cuba because they're given political asylum there. Rob Williams had met Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and some other people in New York in 1961 when the Cuban delegation was at the UN, and actually that was a famous time when they left downtown New York and Manhattan because they felt they were treated shabbily, so they went to the Teresa Hotel in Harlem, and I think that's where Rob Williams and Malcolm X and some other people met Fidel Castro and some of the other leadership of Cuba. So the groundwork was laid for them to go to Cuba.
yes.
And tell us about some of that. I was really curious, like there is a time, he was there for about 5 years or something like that. And so he had a radio show, he had 4 years. And so tell us about the challenges of finding footage and audio from when Rob Williams was in Cuba.
The challenge wasn't so great. Rob and Mabel kept incredible archives. So the Bentley archives at the University of Michigan have Radio Free Dixie. So there's about, I don't know, we use about 12 of 15 pieces of music from Radio Free Dixie, which is just amazing.
Say more about Radio Free Dixie.
Well, I mean, Radio Free Dixie, Rob and Mabel would co-host it, and it was all this fabulous music, much of it not being played on white stations. Nina Simone and Otis Redding, Sam Cooke, Lead Belly. There was a political message that Rob was giving. And, it started out and it reached an audience, particularly in the South, but as historians would say, between the CIA and the FBI, eventually its signal, it would not reach a lot of folks, but yeah.
It's shortwave radio, probably, which is another term that people who are of a certain age don't know what that is.
What is that? Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I found something from the New York Times about that. And in July 1964, there was a headline that said, "Expatriate on Cuban radio calls on Negroes to meet violence with violence."
Uh-huh.
And then it says, these English language programs, inflammatory in their content, debunk the nonviolent integration efforts of Negro organizations, and they promise, quote, unquote, kill-ins to follow the sit-ins, sleep-ins, stand-ins, and the other forms of peaceful protest. So this is what the New York Times is, saying about Rob Williams then. I mean, and that's the earliest I could find from a national newspaper, a national non-Black newspaper, on reporting on Rob Williams.
Well, there's some coverage, when he has to flee the U.S., and so there'll be some national coverage, and then there's some national coverage when on the kissing case when he gets involved in that. But you're right; it will come as a rule much later. So.
And what was the nature of that reporting that you saw? I mean, even about the kissing. The kissing case is about was a young little boy, black boy, and who gets
Right.
basically accused of
A harmless game with a kiss, yeah, right on the cheek. Well, I think the best example of what coverage was like is that that 1964 film that is called The Violent Crusader that a North Carolina television station does. The reporter goes to Cuba, and actually it's probably one of the best finds in the research process for this particular film, and I can tell you that story because it's pretty amazing. But it's Rob is to be, I mean, the title of the film is The Violent Crusader. Rob is somebody to be terrified of. And Rob is going to make the situation worse for Black people. His actions are not condoned by right-thinking African Americans. It's the tone of the 1964 film called The Violent Crusader that's incorporated into Negroes with Guns.
Okay.
So we did not, we had heard rumor that the film existed, and we'd been looking for it, and we'd actually hired a director of research that was from the Charlotte, North Carolina area. And she was in a back room of a television station. It was in a box. And, it's an amazing piece of sort of the attitude of that time. And I think that's what you're getting to, Cornelius, of that sort of portrayal of Rob. Yeah.
And that particularly, was that only in North Carolina that it was broadcast, or was it also that national broadcast entities?
To my knowledge, just North Carolina.
Okay. So Rob was an internationalist. I mentioned that earlier, and he really wanted to internationalize the support for the Black struggle in the U.S. He goes to Cuba. He's there for 4 years, and then he eventually goes to China. But he also goes on the way, I think he stops off in Vietnam because he's also very opposed to the Vietnam War.
Yes.
He meets with Ho Chi Minh.
Yes.
And also, has a conversation with Ho Chi Minh where Ho Chi Minh says that he lived in Harlem, and he went to some meetings of the Garvey organization, and so they seem to get along. And I think also during that time, Rob Williams did a broadcast of a Radio Hanoi to Black soldiers in Vietnam.
Yes.
Did you find any of that, or and that still exists? Is that in the archive or anything?
Yes. There's actually, and things we couldn't include in the film, there are, the CIA was, in particular in China, was having Rob recorded. And so we have transcripts, but they're so redacted that it's very hard. The transcripts are redacted, and we actually had recordings, and we had them professionally sort of restored. But
you're frozen.
Follow the thread of the conversation. Yeah.
Okay. So when he goes, I'm going to ask the same question about Cuba, about China as I did about Cuba. Is like, what were the challenges of getting material from when they were in China, visual as well as audio?
Yeah. The challenges there were not as great as the domestic materials, simply because the Williams kept just an incredible archive, and a lot of the China imagery and documents are in the Williams, the Bentley archive at the University of Michigan.
So in 1969, he comes back to the States, and that's seems like a complicated story that he would be in China and then but want to come back to the States. And so you do have footage of when he does come back. I mean Walter Cronkite is narrating from a news broadcast about him coming back. So talk a bit about that transition and how you wanted to present it in the film.
Rob coming back to the U.S. Yeah, it's really complicated to give you sort of the backstory of how it all came about, and that, you know, Nixon wanted rapprochement with China, and this was an opportunity for Rob to come back because they were hoping to get information from Rob. You know, Rob's sort of final chapter for me is it's a source of inspiration, but it's also a reminder of the strengths of this character. So the film tries to you know, it gives that he wanted to be alive. He wanted to be a leader in civil rights that was not murdered, you know, and that could go home. And he uses the term he could go home to his Mount Vernon, and that happened. But yeah, this figure and the film leaves you with that, and you know, and basically the message he's still sending there at the end of the film is, if people want to call me a criminal for standing up for justice, for equal rights, for our due, then I hope I will always be a criminal. And I think he felt that way. I didn't know Rob. Rob was, when we started the film, Rob had already been dead a few years. So, but, you know, listening to him over and over those 22 hours, reading all the things he had to say, you know, it sort of reinforced again what I mentioned earlier, that notion of righteous anger. And so it was important, and you mentioned this in the film. So he comes off that plane defiant. So he's dressed in a Mao suit. He's raises his fist in Black Power. You've got Max Roach's Freedom Suite, now 3, running underneath him. And he opens by saying, you know, he said, America, you may recall if you've seen the film, America is not God. It is not God. And so he consistently, this was, and Mabel talks about it, this was a man that believed in law and order and then despaired, finally would despair of the fact that he didn't believe that African Americans could get it in the United States. And so I hope that remains consistent, even though he returns to Mount Vernon. This was still a man of extraordinarily strong convictions about what it meant to be a patriot. What it meant, I mean, and that was the goal of the film. It was to provoke every one of us to think about what is dissent and what is righteous dissent, and how he advocated for that, and how our notions of being a patriot were so clouded by white privilege. And that he never lost that message, you know, until his death. It's very much a part of his story, and that was the goal of the film, was to have that and hopefully provoke, like it did for me. By the way, this film was transformative for me. It was revelatory. It revealed to me how limited my knowledge of the civil rights movement was, how shallow my understanding of and my empathy for African Americans' pain and suffering in this country, a country that touted itself as the world's leading democracy. And Rob consistently pointed out that hypocrisy from the time he returned from World War II. And I mean, I think that's a powerful legacy. And I was really shocked when we first came across this story and no one had really told it, because I thought it was amazing commentary.
But there are other examples of self-defense, and people advocated armed
Yes.
self-defense. And I think people don't necessarily know about that, even aspect of the civil rights movement in the South, that their communities were armed. The people had guns because of being in the country and for hunting and everything, but also for self-defense against the Klan and other people who would attack folks.
Sure.
And even people will talk about that in the civil, even going to Mississippi, that there are, people who come from the North, that they knew that they could be safe, even though the movement officially was saying nonviolent.
Right.
That people knew that people had guns in their house and they could defend themselves. One aspect I forgot to mention is that first time I heard about Rob Williams was, I think, in something related to the Black Panthers. Either it was Eldridge Clayborne, Huey Newton, it maybe even being inspired by the
book
story of
by his book, by his
book,
philosophies, economic and otherwise,
And someone asked about how to see the film, and so I just will say this now about Canopy. If you're in an area where a public library subscribes to Canopy, you can use your library card to watch it for free. It's also available on Vimeo for a very small price, and also California Newsreel is one of the distributors of the film. I want to read something from the New York Times that I found about after he came back, and this was 1971, and the headline was "Negro Former Exile." I guess we were still Negroes at the New York Times in 1971. It is shocked by bad race relations. Williams said police brutality against Blacks is still a source of major friction, as well as the court system nationwide. The place of lynching has shifted from the town square to the courthouse as far as Black people are concerned. Blacks go to jail every day for things white people go free for. So I think that's a way to sort of end as far as what his feelings are about returning to the U.S.
Yes.
The other thing I just want to mention before we Elizabeth have some of the questions is that the Freedom Archives also has information about Rob Williams and Mabel Williams, and their website is freedomarchives.org. So there are questions and comments from people, Elizabeth? Other than how to watch the film?
Elizabeth, you need to unmute.
Oh yeah, you need to.
Okay, I thought I did. Thank you.
That's all right, Elizabeth. Usually that's my job.
So Margot Daschel asks, I wonder if you uncovered the fact that Julian Mayfield and John Henrik Clark of the Harlem Writers Guild delivered guns and other aid to Williams on a number of occasions.
There were, wow, nice job. I wish I'd had you on the research team. So yes, there were multiple people that were delivering out of Harlem guns down to Monroe, and actually from various places around the country.
That's the only question that I've gotten so far. So I welcome people if you have questions or comments and you want to type them in the chat.
I see 22 in my chat. Is that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. We'll let you say it.
Sure. Yeah, I just kind of tuned in, wondering if you guys are have discussed how like the NRA can play hand in providing guns for an enemy it sees as people as it sees as an enemy, and that being armed might not be necessarily a good thing.
Um,
didn't the group that Rob was part of wanted a charter to be an NRA group in the 1950s, and the NRA was a different group than it is now.
yeah, so they did. I mean, there were a number of, you asked me earlier about one of the things I wish that, there were several things I wish we could have done more with in the film, and one of them was the role of vets in the Guard, the Armed Guard in Monroe, and yes, they had a chapter of the National Rifle Association in Monroe. And again, it was a matter of self-defense. The Klan was riding through on a fairly regular basis. The head of the Carolina Klan lived not far, James Catfish Cole. And so they would come through shooting up the neighborhood, the black neighborhood in Monroe. So hence the need for the chapter of the NRA in Monroe.
Okay, Suki Blanc asks, can you say more about his relationship to the Panthers and influence? You mentioned economics.
Well, Rob, and again, you know, this is one of the limitations, Suki, in my opinion, of the film, television, is that its strength is emotion, its weakness sometimes is really going deeper into things. And one of the things that we don't do justice with on Rob is that this was really a thoughtful guy that spent a lot of time in philosophy and was knowledgeable and thinking about it. So, I mean, Rob was thinking about boycotting in early days and how that power resided as well and as much in the economics of the black community and the importance of that. So yes, he would influence the Panthers in more than just the notion of armed self-defense.
Do you think that the image of the Panthers with rifles that was famously captured, do you think that might have caused an upset in some parts of America, and might have created problems for some of the African Americans in those communities, smaller communities that were not armed or ready to be armed?
You mean during the period of Rob? Are you talking about during the 60s? Are you talking about the Panthers in their heyday?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Well, certainly, Dr. King, in fact, in a dispute with Rob that played out in a magazine, one of his concerns was that the very visible armed self-defense would lead to the adversary, whites, that had a much larger numbers and arsenal coming in and into these smaller communities that were not prepared to meet violence with violence because they didn't have the weapons and they didn't have the numbers, and so that there was an inherent danger. I don't know if that's what you're speaking to, but that was Dr. King's concern.
Right, danger and reactionary threat until those soft points,
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Aaron Kennedy, who asks, what challenges did you face as a white filmmaker in covering such a powerful Black story? Black people unwilling to talk to you, white people upset with you for telling the story, etc.
Oh, right, great question. Not Black people unwilling to talk. Memory is the biggest challenge. You can imagine the community, everybody's very proud of Rob, and so we have the night that Rob flees, I mean, Monroe's a really small community, by the way, outside Charlotte. There are multiple people that said they drove Rob out. Well, that would have required them probably to drive a couple of blocks, let him out, and he gets in another car, drives a couple of blocks. It's, you know, you want to be part of that because he was this sort of magnificent man in that community. So sort of sorting through, well, it was easy with the white people. They wouldn't talk to us. Okay, we have one white person, and you can see sort of the tenor. His comment is, you know, the Freedom Riders come to town, and they have, having grown up in the Deep South, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard this expression about African Americans. But in this case, they had the liberal elites with them, and they had atrocious manners. You know, so that's his comment. They had atrocious manners talking about the Freedom Riders. So white people wouldn't talk to us. Did we run into other issues? Yes. This is where I talked about this being transformative for me. The African American, Rob's cousin that went with us everywhere, we went to lunch one day. And we're walking out, and there were a few white men in front of us. So the white man, one of them stopped, held the door open for me. She was right behind me. He just shut it in her face. And, you know, it was shocking. I mean, I'm sure those of you African Americans, this is just countless times every day. But to see it, you know, and to experience it, and made me so angry. So it wasn't dealing with just how to deal with Rob's righteous anger. It was how to deal with my anger in making the film. The second thing was it didn't end up in the film, but we were going to do a scene, and we needed an older car. And so we rented a car, and I hired a second unit to film this. I couldn't be there. And the director of photography called me, and he said, you know, I know we paid. The guy says he's going to give the money back. He got here. He said, I just told him we were doing a film and that we needed the car to film. And the guy asked me, so I just told him what the film was about. And he said, you're not going to use my car for a film about Rob, this white guy, about Rob Williams. So those are the kinds of things that we encountered in making the film.
Okay, I'm going to combine these two questions.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask a question.
Oh, you want to go ahead, Cornelius.
Did you ever think of doing reenactments? That's one thing, and you know, acting. And the other question was about the Crusader, his publication, and focusing on that, or where is that available? So those are my questions.
Yeah, the Crusader was in the archives, Bentley Archives at the University of Michigan. It was where the largest collection was. Yes, we did, and actually we did some reenactments, but ultimately at the end of the day, we didn't feel like most of those worked, so we did more just sort of a stylization, like the clothes hanging on the line rather than a full-fledged reenactment.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, okay.
Okay, so I was going to combine these two questions because they're sort of related, and that's, how is the film received after its release, especially in Monroe? And then someone else asked, what race issues still exist in Monroe today, if you are familiar with that?
You know, it eventually, Monroe, it took a couple of years, gave Mabel the key to the city, which was shocking, but still not much recognition of Rob in Monroe. You know, I haven't been back to Monroe. Monroe has changed in that all of these small communities around Charlotte have become increasingly bedroom communities for Charlotte. So it's almost now, even when we were making the film, there was a little bit of a boundary. You sort of knew when you left Charlotte and you went through and you went to various small towns. That's almost not the case now. It's just like, a strip of commercial all the way till you get to the community of Monroe.
Okay.
And Rob and Mabel are buried in Monroe.
Somebody asks, I'm curious, in what way would you approach, I'm sorry, this is Carl Pumpinen. What way would you approach covering what is unfolding now? You mentioned a touchstone. What would your touchstones be filming now?
Carl, wow. I first of all, he's a great filmmaker, Stanley Nelson, made the comment, and I don't want to misquote him, but basically Stanley was just saying that this film, like George Floyd's film, needs to be told by a director of color. I believe that as well. I share that sentiment. There is a level of pain and a level of despair that I think that it requires that voice. And for me, I am in such a place of despair myself. I don't know what my right now my touchstone is despair, and that is not a great place to be in for making a film. It doesn't mean it's not one of your touchstones. And the other is shame and humility, and I just don't know how that plays out yet. I'm sorry, that's not a very good response, but I'm just being really honest with you, sort of about this place. Heartbroken that I'm hearing I'm seeing the same thing that Rob was talking about, in 57, and the same thing that has been happening for so very long.
Thank you for that. So we just have a couple minutes left, and there's one more question from Victor Harrison. It says, do you think that the film's release at this time could cause further injury in the shape of armed demonization if this retro notion gets traction?
I saw that kind of popped up, and I don't know if Victor, you can weigh in if you were posing that to everybody in the group, because I would like to hear people's comments. I mean, I don't take that lightly. I mean, I reflect on that.
Yeah, maybe. I think personally, I'm an anti-gun kind of person. A release later, after things settles down, might be best. Kids get notion of this and get the idea to defend themselves, like the opposition is overly defended in this country, overly ready in this country. That's just war. That's just civil war, armed civil war. I say let the law take care of them. Just be a good citizen. Let the law take care of the bad players out there on the right side, on the right wing side, and
Sure. Well, let me just sort of two things. One, I'm absolutely anti-gun. They were never in my house. I am completely anti-gun, but I also grew up in the Deep South and understood. And and this would be the key, right, Victor? He has often been taken out of context, unfairly depicted. Cornelius was talking about some of that earlier in the press. And that would always be the danger, right? That, or that goes through my mind, taken out of context. What are the implications of this? But I'd be curious if anybody else had a comment. I'd love to hear it.
So if you want to make a comment on this topic, go ahead and unmute yourself. We just have a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think what I like about the film, Bond's comment, that the story is told, it's clear that Robert is rooted in a community of love, of what is
Yes.
just, and that looking at self-defense in the arms, in the reflection of justice, of what is justice and the right to protect yourself in justice. I think the young people will be inspired by it. Now, we're not in the 60s, so they have to look at him as a mentor, as an inspiration, and in terms, but I only see him and his life an inspiration, and it's an inspiration for the young people. So that's what I think that story brought for me. To answer that question, and I think the young people are smart enough, having looked at Black Lives Matters, the Black Futures, Rising Majority, with these young people. These are very thoughtful young people, and I think when they get to stage 2 of this, they will use mentors like this to integrate what happens in the 21st century.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Do I have time, Elizabeth? It's just very short. I wanted to share with everybody, it seems maybe a nice way to sort of go out, what Mabel said in an interview that I did with her in 2003. It's not in the film. It's a very personal moment. And I asked her what her greatest regret was and what her greatest joy. Her greatest regret was losing Rob and her oldest son.
Yeah, I would love for you to close with that. Whoops, what happened?
You're muted.
Oh,
Sorry. Her greatest joy, her greatest regret was losing Rob and her oldest son. Her greatest joy, and this is direct from her quotation. My greatest joy is that I have lived this life and I have survived it. I have learned to love despite the hate that has been there. The joy in seeing young people, white and Black, who are really dedicated to making a change so we can all live together in peace. So that was 2003. She died in April 2014.
thank you so much.
Sure.
Beautiful way to end.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Sandy.
It was,
Thank you.
Thank you, Cornelius. Yeah.
Sure.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
So I want to thank both Cornelius and Sandy for joining us today. Cornelius for helping create this series. And we're very excited for next month's selection. So July's selection is the documentary Chisholm 72, Unbought and Unbossed. And
Great film.
yeah, the meeting will be on the second Sunday of the month, Sunday, July 12th, again at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And Shola Lynch, the filmmaker, will be with us. This film is streaming on multiple platforms, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding it. So please do take some time to watch it ahead of time and then join us on July 12th. And in addition, all of the programming that we've been providing at MOAD has been free online. And we, of course, welcome your donations to help support this free public programming that we've been doing. We love the connection that we have with everyone during this time. But if you do have a few dollars to send our way, we would appreciate it. And I've put in the chat, you can either donate at moadsf.org, or you can give by cell. And the way that you give by cell is you text the number 56512, and then you type in the word MOADSF, MOADSF. And once you do that, you'll receive a link that will allow you to donate directly to us. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you again, Cornelius and Sandy, and I hope to see
It
you
was
all
great.
next month.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
And also, you can check out our calendar at moadsf.org and see all different programs that we're doing. We're doing quite a few online public programs. So please check us out, and we welcome you to join any of them. And we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks,
Thank
Sandy. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.